Hi, this is a response to, oh my god, it's Chris's video on sex industry. Kind of reluctant to dive back in here again, but let's give it a go. I think there's two bits I want to pick up on. I think these are two videos actually, and it's specifically to do not with legalisation, but to do with stigma and stigmatization. Because yourself on that video there, and some of the other videos I've seen, there's a desire not just to remove the legal constraints about prostitution, but also to remove the stigmas attached to it, which is a bit of a taller order. I think it's relatively easy to take a law away or to change a law, but to change people's hearts and minds is a much more serious enterprise. But I think if you were to try and do that, I think there's two aspects of it. I may be wrong, but I think there's two aspects of it. I think there's one to do with um, a stigmatization that comes out of a particular kind of set of moral precepts to do with sexuality, and then there's a different kind of stigma, which I'll probably talk about in a different video. But the one, yeah, I think in terms of this thing about stigma associated with morality, there's different components of that, and some of those I've got sympathy with, and some of those I really haven't. Some of them are just bullshit. I mean, certainly any kind of moral injunction against prostitution, which comes out of a kind of Judeo-Christian tradition. You know, it's associated with a particular religious belief, even if it's just a kind of the kind of cultural Christianity that you find in even in societies with secular societies. If it's associated with that tradition, then it's clearly bullshit, and you can ignore it. You know, I don't think there's any need to moralise about any kind of sexuality based on those premises, and that would include the commodification of sexuality in the form of prostitution. So I think if anybody tries to launch a moral argument in those grounds, I think people would be right in calling bullshit on that, and I would certainly also say that's crap. I think there's another set of moral arguments which are based in patriarchy, actually, I think, which is, I might be wrong here, but this is my intuition, which is to do with a kind of sense of ownership of women's sexuality. I mean, certainly there's a lot been written over the years about how in patriarchal societies, control over women's sexuality by men is a big influence. I mean, you see it particularly in well, it's most self-evident in Islamic societies right now, but it's prevalent in many societies, and it's prevalent in ours. You know, it's a bit more undercover, but it's still there. And that patriarchy isn't just embedded in institutions and laws and language; it's also embedded, I think, at the level of morality. You know, men feel sexual jealousy about women, and that is felt as a kind of moral sense, a sense of moral outrage. And as I say, to the extent that that emerges out of patriarchal relationships and control over women's bodies and women's sexuality, that's no good foundation for a moral sense. Even if it's a deeply felt and apparently authentically felt sense in a guy or a woman, it's still not a good foundation for that moral sense. So I think you can also dispense with that kind of moral approbation. I don't think we need to take that into account either. But I think there's a third sense in which there's a kind of moral agenda, or a set of moral stigmas attached, or stigmas which come out of a moral sense, which perhaps have more traction, and which I can certainly see a little bit more sympathy with, at least to the extent that I would find it difficult to remove them from my own thinking, which is that sort of strange double-edged aspect of sexuality, which is about how it exists within relationships and how it exists outside of relationships, if I can codify it like that. And really I'm drawing from this on his blog post that this chap sent me, and I'll put a link to his really great post he sent me I'll put it in the downstairs bar, whatever it's called, the information box. And what he was saying there is that that desire has two functions, or at least he speculated. He says there's this thing which he refers to as reciprocal desire, which is the kind of desire you get in relationships. You know what I mean? You have a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a marriage partner or something like that, and your desire is echoed back at you. You know what I mean? And that shared reciprocating desire is the foundation, or is part of the cement, perhaps, for the communion that takes place in those kind of relationships. which isn't necessarily to mean that every single act of intercourse is perfectly reciprocal and perfectly balanced with mutual orgasms on all sides. It might be that it's more negotiated than that, and it might be that it's, you know, it varies, but it always exists in this sense of a reciprocation within the context of a defined relationship, and is in some way the validation of that relationship. You know, I mean, one of the most surest ways of hurting someone inside a relationship is to kind of refuse to desire them or refuse their desire. So it does exist very strongly within relationships, and has for, let's face it, for a long time. But then there's this other kind of desire, which the person who sent me this blog article referred to as rapacious desire. It's a slightly loaded term, it's not the one I would use. Rapacious desire, which is desire that one person has for self-fulfillment, for sexual fulfillment, in which case that person may go out, find a consenting adult who is willing to get involved in an adult transaction, and enact that desire with that as part of a commodity exchange. There's no context of a relationship around it. He makes an interesting comment about consent, by the way, which is slightly a side issue. Which consent, he says, is the absolute minimum requirement of a sexual relationship. I think in the original video, the Peach said this thing about consensual sex, but consent is the absolute minimum, below which everything is rape. Yeah, but most desirous relationships are a little bit more than consent. Yeah. Doesn't have to be, but I think that's necessary. That is the case. So we have these two different desires. We have reciprocal desire in the formation, in that kind of communion, aspiration to communion within relationship, and then we have this other rapacious desire, which treats sexuality as a commodity, which is it's kind of fine. It's kind of fine. But speaking purely personally, I would have a problem with it. I mean, I wouldn't want to generalise beyond personal experience here. But I would have a problem being involved in a relationship, on either side of this relationship, in which reciprocal desire was one of the glues that held that relationship together, and then going out the following night, going through exactly the same motions, doing exactly the same physical behaviours as part of a piece of kind of instrumental, rapacious desire just to get my rocks off. I think my partner, my wife, would feel justified in being slightly pissed off by that. And if the positions were reversed, I would feel slightly pissed off by that. Because the glue that's holding the relationship together has been squirted over someone else's stomach. Yeah, I mean, of course, there's things around that. Of course, you could limit it to single people, or you could find ways, you know, maybe not everyone feels that. But I think certainly within that, there's a sense of a morality, which I can hold my hand up as having some validity. I don't go with the idea of religious authority for morality and that kind of tradition. I don't go with the idea of patriarchy and ownership as any kind of basis for morality. But I wouldn't be willing to squander that third source of morality, which is to do with the distinction between reciprocal desire and rapacious desire, and the kind of commodification of the flesh which comes out of that. As I say, I might be idiosyncratic on that one, but that's how I think. And as long as you've got that kind of moral injunction in place, then you've got a stigma problem, I think. I think I would quite rightly feel stigmatized if I was to not follow the logic of that morality I've just described. I would feel quite justifiably stigmatized. And I would feel quite justified in stigmatizing another person, I think, you know, a loved one, stigmatizing that person if they're similarly played fast and loose with that kind of currency of desire that I've spoken about. Anyway, thanks very much for that. I'm going to do another video on a different kind of version of stigma, but that'll do for now, I think. Thanks very much.